Imagine this. It's the dead of winter. Somewhere inside a hardened Soviet command bunker, a radar operator leans forward. His screen, which should be clean, which is always clean, is alive with ghost signals. Dozens of them, moving fast. And they are not supposed to be there. He calls his supervisor. His supervisor calls the general. And the general stares at that screen with a look that no training exercise had ever prepared him for. Because what those blips represented wasn't just aircraft. It was the complete failure of a system that the Soviet Union had spent billions of rubles and decades of engineering to make unbreakable. The B-52 was flying where no B-52 should have been able to fly, and no one was stopping it. How did this happen? How did one of the most sophisticated air defense networks on Earth, a web of radar stations, interceptor jets, and surface-to-air missiles, fail to stop a lumbering Cold War bomber? And what did that night reveal about the balance of power that both superpowers had spent decades trying to maintain? To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when the Soviet Union built what many military analysts called the most formidable air defense system the world had ever seen. After World War II, the Soviet leadership understood one terrifying reality. American bombers could reach Moscow. That was not a theory. That was a fact. And so they built a system designed around one purpose: to make sure that no American aircraft would ever reach its target alive. The network they constructed was called the PVO Strany, the National Air Defense Forces. By the 1960s, it was unlike anything that had ever existed. Thousands of radar installations stretched across 11 time zones. Early warning systems could detect incoming aircraft hundreds of miles from the border. Fighter interceptors sat at alert status at bases across the Soviet interior. And threaded through all of it were the SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, the same missiles that had shot down Francis Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960. That shoot-down sent a message the entire world heard. The Soviets could reach into the sky and pull down anything they wanted. The Americans understood this. Their bombers, especially the B-52 Stratofortress, were originally designed to fly high and fast over enemy territory. But after the Powers incident, it was clear. High altitude was no longer safe. The SAMs owned the upper sky, so the Americans did something that changed everything. They went low. Low-level penetration. It sounds simple. It was anything but. Flying a B-52, an aircraft the size of a city block, at altitudes of 300 to 500 feet above the ground, in the dark, at high speed, was one of the most brutally demanding missions in aviation history. The crews trained for it for years. They flew in complete radio silence. They memorized routes that threaded through radar gaps, valleys, mountain ridges, areas where the curvature of the Earth itself blocked Soviet detection. At low altitude, radar loses its advantage. The ground clutter, trees, hills, buildings, fills a radar screen with noise, and inside that noise, a B-52 becomes almost invisible. But there was something else the Americans had developed, something the Soviets didn't fully anticipate. Electronic warfare. Inside the B-52, dedicated crew members operated jamming systems so powerful they could blind a radar receiver from miles away. They could spoof false targets, making one aircraft look like a dozen, scattering tracking systems across ghost signals that led nowhere. The B-52 wasn't just a bomber. By this point, it was a flying electronic warfare platform. The Soviets knew jamming existed. They had their own systems. But what they didn't fully know was how far American technology had advanced, or how the Americans planned to use it. Now imagine the mission. The aircraft take off in the darkness, no formation lights, engines at low power until they reach altitude, then descend rapidly as they cross towards Soviet airspace. The crew speaks in short, clipped phrases. The electronic warfare officer powers up his equipment. The jamming begins. Hundreds of miles away, the first Soviet radar station picks up interference. Not a contact, interference. The operator adjusts his frequency. The interference follows him. He switches again. It follows again. This is the moment the plan begins to work. The Soviet air defense network depended on coordination. Every radar station fed information upward to regional command centers, which then fed the national command. The interceptors couldn't scramble without a clear track. The SAM batteries couldn't engage without a confirmed target. And when the radar picture started degrading, when contacts appeared and vanished, when tracks jumped and split, the entire system slowed down. Inside the command centers, officers were receiving contradictory reports. One station reported contacts bearing northwest. Another reported the same contacts bearing east. A third reported nothing at all. Which one was real? Were any of them real? And while the Soviets debated, while the interceptors waited for orders that were too slow in coming, the B-52s kept moving. Low, fast, invisible beneath the radar horizon. The SAM crews were ordered to stand by alert. They were waiting for tracking data that was arriving corrupted, or not at all. One battery received a track. They began to engage. And then the track vanished. Another ghost, another electronic deception. They stood down. The bomber had already passed. This was the essential revelation of that night. The Soviet air defense network was built for a specific kind of threat. High-altitude bombers flying straight and fast with minimal electronic support. It was not fully prepared for what it was actually facing. Aircraft flying under its radar coverage, wrapped in jamming signals, using the terrain itself as a shield. The system had a structural flaw that technology and doctrine had concealed for years. It was layered, but its layers had gaps. And those gaps existed at exactly the altitudes the Americans were now exploiting. The SA-2 was optimized for high-altitude targets. Below a certain height, its radar fuse became unreliable. The kill zone shrank, and 300 feet above the ground was exactly below that zone. When the mission ended, when the aircraft turned for home and climbed back to altitude, the Soviet command centers tried to reconstruct what had happened. The picture they assembled was not reassuring. The lessons were stark. Their radar network had gaps at low altitude that electronic jamming made nearly impossible to overcome. Their command and control system was too slow to respond to rapidly degrading information. Their SAM batteries needed reliable tracking data that couldn't be provided when jamming was active. And their interceptors couldn't engage targets they couldn't find. The response was immediate and expensive. New radar types optimized for low-altitude detection began development. Fighter interceptors were retrained for low-level engagement. SAM systems were upgraded. The entire doctrine of Soviet air defense began a painful, costly revision. NATO's own analysts absorbed the same lessons from the other side. Low-level penetration worked, but only with the right tools, the right training, and the right technology working together. Electronic warfare wasn't a supplement to the mission. It was the mission. New aircraft were already being designed with these lessons built in. The future of strategic penetration would not look like high-altitude bombers screaming through defended airspace. It would look like stealth, like terrain masking, like electronic dominance, the art of making yourself invisible before the enemy ever knows you're there. That night, those hours when Soviet radar screens filled with noise and American bombers flew through the gaps, was not a single dramatic battle. There were no explosions, no air-to-air engagements, no dramatic last-second escapes. There was something quieter, and in some ways more significant. There was a moment a system that an entire superpower had trusted with its survival revealed that it could be confused, that it could be deceived, that no defense, however layered, however expensive, however carefully engineered, is ever truly complete. Modern air campaigns still live in the shadow of those lessons. Every stealth aircraft ever built carries the DNA of that doctrine. Every electronic warfare suite, every terrain-following radar, every precision strike package owes something to what was learned in the frozen airspace over the Soviet heartland. In warfare, the balance of power never stands still. It tilts. And on the night the B-52s flew through the gap, the night Soviet radar operators stared at screens full of ghosts while real aircraft passed beneath them, that balance tilted. Quietly, invisibly, exactly the way the Americans planned it.